Thank you. Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, everyone who showed up in person early this morning, and also for everyone who's joining us via the live stream. Today I have the great privilege of conducting a fireside chat with Joe Lubin, and as you know, he's a co-founder of Ethereum and also the founder of Consensus. And today he's here to share his thoughts with us on the social impact in a blockchain world. As a reminder, for those that are both here and also on the live stream, you can follow this conversation via the hashtags BSIC19 and also Ethereum for Impact, that's the number 4. And you can also reach us at the handles Ethereum Joseph and Alicia Syrett. So with that, let's begin. Many of you have probably seen the growing excitement around blockchain. It was quite a buzz at Davos where Joe spoke. There's also, of course, the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, which has attracted huge names like the World Wildlife Fund and also Grameen. And it's an interest that's really attracting a number of various parties, whether that's governments, whether that's non-GOs, philanthropists, investors, technologists. And today, what we hope to do is share a little bit of insight around the whole topic with Joe's help, and maybe give you a little bit of inspiration as you start the day. So we're going to start with a very broad question and then jump into more specifics in the social impact world. But I found a quote on Consensus's website which I thought really encapsulated a lot of the excitement in the area. So this is from Joe, and I think it was on your careers page, so how appropriate to draw people in. Joe is quoted as saying, "We're all here for the same reason, that we sense that something epic and meaningful is happening here, and we are on the cusp of changing everything." So, big potential.
Good quote.
Yeah, excellent quote. So Joe, start us off. How do you see blockchain technology and specifically the core theme of decentralization changing the world?
Hi. It's good to be here. Thanks everybody for being here. So for me, it's all about the nature of trust. So we've built for thousands of years different technologies, and I consider legal systems technologies, counting systems, measurement systems technologies, granaries, etc. And all of those technologies have been built upon a certain trust foundation. And up until recently, that trust foundation had to be centralized, and it was subjective. It is subjective. And so blockchain is really a next generation database technology, and what it brings to all the technologies that we have the ability now to build upon it is a potential new trust foundation. So instead of subjective centralized trust through judicial and other systems, we can start building decentralized systems, automated objective trust systems, and we can rebuild and refound all of our technologies on a much more sound foundation.
Great. So if you're familiar with the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, you know that a lot of their focuses are based upon the United Nations Sustainable Goals. And the United Nations goals are really their blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. And so given that, what I'd like to do is dig into a few different areas of focus for the coalition and talk about the potential of blockchain in transforming these areas. And the first big area, which I would really love to dig into, is financial inclusion. So Joe, specifically, how does the potential of blockchain impact the experience of the underbanked or people who may not be able to access microloans now?
Yeah, so for a very long time it has been, or even now, even in this country, as we heard earlier today, many in our population are unbanked or underbanked, and that's not just the inability to access loans, but it's also the inability to make payments for things, even if you do have the money. There are many situations on this planet where vendors would be very comfortable sending materials across borders, but the payment systems simply haven't been in place for people to buy equipment or some element that enables them to start a business or run a business. And so the first element is just borderless payment systems, ease of sending any amount of money inexpensively across borders or even within borders. In terms of remittances, most of the time fees are in the area of 10%, and that's just far too much money to give up if you're sending money around the world. We're now seeing something called decentralized finance growing quite dramatically, and a lot of that's happening on the Ethereum blockchain system, but it's also happening on other blockchain systems, and a lot of that is about the ability for people to take their own assets and put their own assets on platforms, lend out their own assets, and it feels like that's going to be a very significant transformation. It's closely related to identity because...
We're going to get there.
Yeah, sure. Essentially, if we can have and establish our own what we call self-sovereign identities, then we can have persistent portable reputation on blockchain systems, and all of us in this room have reputation. We can take certain documents into our bank and potentially get a loan based on that persistent portable reputation, but most people in the world don't have, or many people in the world don't have that sort of credentialing to enable them to access microloans, perhaps from some other part of the world. And blockchain, because of the global context that it's embedded in, can enable pools of capital to be formed anywhere and to be made available in the form of microloans to virtually anybody in the world. So we're seeing this foundational layer. So blockchain is a foundational trust layer, and we're building another foundational layer, the foundational decentralized finance layer on top of that, and that's going to enable lots of different use cases on top of that. One thing...
Joe, can I ask you for a concrete example here? Because I know you've done some tremendous work in this area, and I wanted to ask you to talk to us a little bit about Project EyetoEye, Island to Island. This is the financial inclusion project in the Philippines. We worked with Union Bank and a number of other parties to create an intra-rural bank payment platform. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, I feel like that brings it home with a real example.
Sure. EyetoEye is a platform that we built with Union Bank in the Philippines. The Philippines has about 70%, I believe, unbanked or underbanked, and a lot of their population lives on islands, and so they don't have direct connectivity to the national banking infrastructure. And this is a problem that's exacerbated because I think 10% of GDP in the Philippines is via international remittances, and then their local remittances in country. And so Union Bank set out to connect all of the different rural banks. So currently I believe there are 500 rural banks in country, and they've been operating via Excel spreadsheets and pieces of paper to track accounts. And clearing and settlement, when you send money across the country, could last, still can last, for days and weeks. So you're sending money to your uncle or your grandmother, and it gets there and is usable 3 weeks later, which is pretty unacceptable. And so we, in conjunction with Union Bank, and I think you'll be able to hear about that project in much more detail later today, Henry's here, we built a system based on the Ethereum blockchain technology, where essentially an iPad can be placed in each one of these rural banks, and you can clear and settle transactions intranationally in minutes.
And many of the banks weren't on the SWIFT system to begin with, right?
Exactly.
We're talking about a population of 100 or so million.
This is a system
Quite an
that,
impact.
yeah, that is being connected into the central bank, but it's not part of the international SWIFT system.
That's great. And you so nicely segued already into identity, so that's perfect. I'm so glad you brought that up. I'd love to explore that topic a little bit more. Of course, it's another focus of the coalition, and what I'd like to know specifically is your views on how blockchain technology could potentially impact the experience of refugees.
Sure. So, again, all of us have persistent portable identity and persistent portable reputation, but there are so many, not just underbanked, but who just don't have state-issued identity. That can be a problem in your local context, where you don't have access to financial systems. We've built a technology, and others in our ecosystem are building similar technologies that enable us to establish the root of our identity on blockchain. We call it self-sovereign identity, so you can be fully in control of your identity. If you get displaced for any reason, you can reestablish your connection to your identity because it is indelible. It is sitting as a permanent record on a blockchain, and via technology you can essentially reconnect to not only your identity, but if you have assets associated with the address of that identity, then you can effectively move from one place to another place with absolutely nothing, no possessions, and reestablish your identity, and if you have assets, reconnect to your assets.
That's great. I would like to talk about another case study because I feel like these examples, the work that you've done, really brings it home. And for this one, I'd love to talk a little bit about Project Bifrost. So this is a system that expedites and reduces the cost of delivering cash on the ground in crisis areas, and so that makes me think of the refugee example, but also natural disasters. So tell us a little bit about the impact that blockchain technology can make there and what you've done with that project.
Sure. Is Robbie in the room? Oh, there he is. So this is Robbie's project. Robbie drove it. It was based on the realization that different ways of giving aid have been disappointing over a number of years, and instead of deciding what you should give to certain people in different situations, whether it's a refugee context or a disaster context, you should empower them by giving them money, cash transfer programming essentially, and enable them to, whether you're sending cash to aid workers on the ground or whether you're able to send cash to specific refugees directly, you should be able to, you should do that in order to enable them to make their own best decisions for their particular situation, and also to reduce the overhead and the waste. So in terms of just the cash transfers themselves, I think you're probably looking at a haircut of around 10%. Plus there's just so much, I hesitate to call it waste because it's valuable to spend a sizable percentage of donations to run an aid infrastructure, but you can be talking 40% of the money that gets donated, or more in some situations, that just gets employed to run the infrastructure for these aid organizations. And so if you can tokenize money, we worked with a project called Maker and another project called Dether to turn the donations into a cryptocurrency, but it's not a volatile cryptocurrency. like Bitcoin or Ether. It's a price-stable cryptocurrency called Make or Die, so that holds the value of the dollar, and then you can send it instantaneously. So you can send it in seconds. It's received via the Ether wallet, and it can be used. The Ether wallet can be used to pay for goods at designated outlets, or by the owners of those designated outlets to change that into the local currency.
And so the key themes here really are the reduction of intermediaries and also the reduction of costs.
No intermediaries, yeah, or reduced intermediaries,
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the environment. As I mentioned earlier, a member of the coalition is the World Wildlife Fund, and their mission is to conserve nature. And so I wanted to get your thoughts, and you can go as deep as you want to the extent you've done work with them, or more broadly talking about them as an organization. But if you could share some insight on what the potential for an organization like that is with blockchain technology. How could that aid their mission?
So we did one project with the WWF. It was their Fiji branch, their New Zealand branch, and their Australian branch. It was about sustainable fishing in the Pacific Islands, and it was also about human rights and ethical employment, reduction or identification of child labor or slavery on specific boats. And so it's a project that essentially tracks tuna from bait to plate. We worked with Sequest and Traceable. Sequest is a sustainable fishing group. Traceable is about communications in that context. And we essentially built an app, a mobile app, that enables a consumer, and the consumer is the powerful voice here, because if a consumer is not buying a product, it ramifies all the way down the supply chain, and it causes change. And so a fish, yellowfin and albacore tuna, can be caught on a boat. It is RFID tagged, and it's landed, it's papered, the conditions under which it was caught are registered. It is essentially guaranteed to be not illegally fished, and fished in sustainable waters via registered boats. And so those registered boats have proper employment conditions, and the end user can track all of this through the processing of the fish, through the transportation of the fish, through making sure the fish wasn't being transported at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which you really don't want to happen. And you can essentially see all of this on your app. So it's tagged on the boat, and then QR codes are applied to the different products. And ideally, so we've done some pilot projects, and ideally we'll be seeing tuna on shelves that are completely traceable via applications on your phones.
So this really talks to the consumer's desire for full transparency in the supply chain, wanting to know where their food is coming from, what they're putting in their families' mouths. And you also touched upon, so I'm so glad you brought up the supply chain topic, because I did also want to ask you not only about that, but also child labor, which you touched upon. And that's also something that consumers care a great deal about, deciding which products, are conscious of that. Sure. And picking out the most sustainable products. Tell us a little bit more about the work you've done in that area.
Yeah, so very preliminary at this point, but we're working with some brands, including luxury brands, to enable consumers choices, again, to ramify down the supply chain. One of our projects, Viant, is a supply chain track and trace solution. Makes it really easy to build supply chains or supply chain networks. And one would imagine that if you have assessments at each point in a supply chain of the working conditions, ensuring that there isn't any child labor or slavery in your supply chain, and assigning a score of the working conditions at each node along a supply chain. If that score appears either in an app that you're looking at where you're tracking the product on the shelf, or if it's sitting on the shelf itself, if there is a sweater or two sweaters that I'm looking at that are substantially similar, and one has a slave-free labor rating of better than the other one, then I, as a consumer, am obviously going to make the healthier choice. And I feel like rigorous provenance that is enabled by supply chains can, over the next bunch of years, have pretty profound social impact.
That's great. So I'm going to switch gears again, and this time I want to delve into the topic of health and wellness, and more specifically healthcare. And so this is a broad question, but feel free to bring in examples if you'd like. But curious to see what your views are on the potential for blockchain technology, both in terms of medical discoveries, and this could be the quality of the discoveries, the efficiency, and also the patient care experience.
Sure. So the medical industry is wired to collect information on us, and it's wired to collect information to serve itself. So whether it's a pharmacy, or whether it's your GP, or you have an episode in a hospital, they are collecting the information that they need to serve themselves, and in some senses to serve you. But we now have these devices that enable us to monitor health signals in real time, turning the capturing of medical information from these time-sliced little data events to continuous streams of information that can enable us to maintain our health and to optimize our health. And so that's great. I could potentially collect all of that information, keep it on my phone, keep it on my laptop. But in order to make use of that information, in order for anybody to trust that information, it really needs to be potentially signed, cryptographically signed by a medical professional, or if it's coming from a device, the device should sign it, indicating that it hasn't been tampered with, and it needs to be time-stamped. The best way to do all of this is on a public blockchain, a system that's essentially non-repudiable. Once I have my personal information attested to by professionals and time-stamped, then I can make use of it I can send it to my insurance company, or as you were indicating, I can potentially de-identify that data. And it's really hard for us to submit our personal health information to a research study, but in that sort of context, I could de-identify the data. They know it's good data, they know the timing of the data, and I could submit it to a research study.
That's great. So I want to ask you a question, which I know we've kind of been on the topic of healthcare and refugees and the unbanked, but I also think there are a lot of topics that are pretty important to cover that aren't necessarily in those buckets. And this is a bit more topical. So we see a lot of press today about the downsides of centralized power, whether it's a CFO cooking the books, committing fraud. There's a lot of scuttlebutt around Facebook, us as consumers being the products. There's hacks into companies like Equifax, and all of these things are very troubling, and they all come into that theme of the centralized power. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on what the world you imagine will be like when blockchain technology starts affecting some of these companies and people who have power today in these capacities.
Better. Yeah, I think you said it well. Blockchain systems for financial use will enable much less fraud. It's really hard to perpetrate a fraud proactively, and you don't really find that happening very much. Usually something has happened and you're covering something up. And so when you're logging financial information in real time, when you have databases that you can't go into and change historical records of, it's going to certainly create a much more sound financial system. In terms of social networks, which I think you were slightly touching on, we are in this context where journalism has been decimated for different reasons, especially local journalism. We're in this context where we're getting our news from social media. We're in this context where these powerful companies have such great understanding of behavioral psychology that they know us much better than we know ourselves. We are the product of some of these companies, and they data mine our personal information to plump us up as the product, to sell us more expensively, not only our personal information, but our attention. And worse than that, they understand us so well that they can essentially addict us to the use of their systems, turning the systems into what some have called dopamine slot machines, where you're getting this this feedback that gives you a little squirt of dopamine into your pleasure center every time you click or scroll or something of that nature. And it is not only exploitative and destructive of us as people, but it's being turned into a weapon of mass manipulation, and is being used by political actors to affect nation-state security, essentially. And so we may have a solution. Important information should be under our control. It is likely that that social networking systems, unless there is regulation, they'll continue to collect certain kinds of data. But if we are careful with the higher value data, then we can stay in control of that information and potentially use it for our own best interest and enable access to it to entities that we designate. So it's certainly a problem. We have actually new voting systems enabled by blockchain technology, but unless we have really good information, not information that's fed to us in these echo chambers driven by advertising technology, we essentially won't be able to govern ourselves very well. So there are hints of solutions in blockchain technology, but we have a long way to go to clean up that situation.
Thank you. So I know we're cutting close on time now. I want to ask a final question, and that is really for those of us who are in attendance today, who are inspired by what you've said, people watching you on the live stream. How can people get involved? You know, is it potentially joining the coalition? What if they have projects in mind? What are some of the options for people to take the next step?
So blockchain technology is permeating virtually every niche, similar to how internet technology did and does. And at our company, throughout our ecosystem, you can be a technologist, you can be a lawyer, you can be any sort of professional, and find something relevant and valuable to do in the ecosystem. So BSIC is a great group if you're specifically focused on social impact. From my perspective, nearly everything that blockchain does is socially very impactful, because it is, as I indicated at the start, it is enabling us to build a better trust foundation for the planet. So get involved.
Well, thank you again, everyone in attendance today, everyone watching on the live stream. Hopefully this gave you some initial information around some of the potential changes in the areas of environment, in humanitarian issues, in financial inclusion, and hopefully you'll stick around for the rest of the day and continue to be inspired. I want to also give a final shout out to the conference organizers. This is fantastic. And also, if everyone could please join me in thanking Joe Lubin for sharing his thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.